Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining this webinar. We're so excited to introduce to you Audubon's conservation blueprint for the lower Mississippi River. My name is Kara Fox, and I'm the Director of Gulf Coast Restoration for Audubon, and I've served as the project manager for this blueprint. Next slide, Rachel. And just as a reminder, this is being recorded, and we will be sending out this recording to all webinar attendees. We will post it on our website, and we will also post it on our Facebook page. Next slide. So this is the agenda for today's webinar. First, we'll give a quick introduction to the blueprint and how the pieces came together to form our vision for this region. Then we'll dive into some of our current work by highlighting some of our key ongoing projects, then on to challenges and opportunities before diving into the mapping component, which really is the star of the blueprint. We'll then wrap up the presentation with strategies and actions, the nuts and bolts of the blueprint, before we move on to hearing from you during the Q&A session. And as a quick reminder, please go ahead and drop any questions in the chat during the entirety of the presentation, and we'll address those at the end during the Q&A session. So now I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie Green, ecologist for our Strawberry Plains Audubon Center. Stephanie?
Good afternoon. As Kara said, my name is Stephanie Green, and I am located here at our Strawberry Plains Audubon Center in North Mississippi. Before we dive into the blueprint, we wanted to just take the opportunity to at least visually introduce you to all of the members, the core team, project team members for this project. And just to let you know that we're all readily available through our emails. And if you wanted to reach out to one of us later, you'd be more than welcome to. Next slide. So the very fact that you set aside 45 minutes to an hour of your busy afternoon to join us for a webinar titled The Lower Mississippi River Conservation Blueprint tells me that I probably don't have to sell you on the importance of the Mississippi River. You probably already know. But what I wanted to do is just kind of set the stage for why we're working on this blueprint. The Mississippi River is probably one of the most vital natural features in all of North America. And in fact, it's the fourth largest river system in the entire world. Over 12 million people live along the banks of the river. And each year, upwards of 400 billion is added to the US economy alone. So it's really not hard. It would be hard to overstate the importance, both hydrologically and economically, as well as culturally, that the importance that the Mississippi River has to this nation, as well as on a worldwide scale. But the river isn't just important hydrologically or economically, it's also an important corridor, and not just for human traffic or for commerce, but for wildlife as well, and especially for birds. The Mississippi River Basin is home to over 350 species of birds that use this region, either in part of it or all of it, at some point in time in their annual life history. If you look at a map of the world, you'll quickly recognize the large river systems in the world usually run east-west. The Mississippi River is a little unique in that it runs north-south. So what that does is it centers the Mississippi River as a central keystone in this long migratory pathway that connects birds from the top of the Arctic all the way down to the very southern tip of South America. Along the way, the basin drains a huge diversity of habitats that range from forested and coastal wetlands to prairies, and then to our upland forest of oak and hickory, as well as our pine-dominated systems. So these habitats provide both nesting and foraging areas for birds, and they also provide important wintering and migratory stopover habitat that's essential to the birds that are calling this area home. I probably also don't need to tell you that increasingly the Mississippi River and its ecosystems are coming under threat. Those threats come in the form of human engineering or development, as well as climate change. And they show up in ways such as increased pollution, nutrients, runoff, increased sea level rises, and as well as increasing temperatures, heavier rainfall events, or just these seemingly ever more common extreme weather events that we're seeing. Next slide. So we are Audubon, and what that means is that we tend to focus our conservation efforts through the lens of birds. One of the reasons that we do this is that we recognize that birds act as important indicators of ecosystem health. And if we recognize that, then we also need to recognize that of these 350 species that utilize the Mississippi River, 20% of those are listed as either continental or regional birds of conservation concern by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So the declines in certain populations within this region tell us that the conservation and the restoration of this ecosystem is vital for both the birds and the human communities that call this area home. Next slide. So I've spent a little bit of time talking about the Mississippi River Basin as a whole. And now I want to kind of zero in on the lower portion of it. We wanted to use this blueprint as a way to focus our conservation work, but also as a way to connect work that's happening at the Gulf Coast, all the way up to the work that's happening in the Great Lakes and in the upper Mississippi Flyway. So for the purposes of our blueprint, we have our definition of the lower Mississippi River is that portion of the Mississippi River Basin stretching from the confluence of the Missouri River at St. Louis all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And then we've included some adjacent watersheds such as the Pascagoula River watershed and the Atchafalaya Basin. So you might look at this and say, this is kind of a slightly different definition or geographical boundary of what is typically used to describe the lower Mississippi River region. And you would be correct. But the reason why we chose to define it this way is because of our physical presence within this region. If you see on this map, we have centers and sanctuaries located across the region that act as really nice bookmarks to a central location. Starting at the Audubon Center at Riverlands, just north of St. Louis, traveling down the river. On the west side, you have the Little Rock Audubon Center in Arkansas. On the east side of the river basin, you have the Strawberry Plains Audubon Center in North Mississippi. And then all the way down to the coast where you find the Pascagoula River Audubon Center, and then our coastal bird stewardship programs that are located in the Mississippi and the Louisiana coast. And then last but not least, you have the Paul Rainey Wildlife Sanctuary in Southwest Louisiana. Next slide. So for our blueprint, what we've done is we've focused on 16 priority bird species to help us represent our conservation priorities, as well as our needs and those opportunities that exist within this region. These species represent a broad spectrum of the bird communities, as well as the diverse habitats that are located throughout this region. It's our hope that this blueprint will help us identify strategies and actions to protect both the birds and the people that are here in the lower Mississippi River region. Next. Our vision for the blueprint and for this region is a healthy and connected network of habitats in the lower Mississippi River region that support sustainable bird populations and that strengthen the resilience of human communities, both against human-made and natural threats. Next. So I indicated just a little bit ago that we defined our geographical boundaries based on our physical location, as well as some other components. And that's why we chose the geographical definition of the lower Mississippi River region, the one that we did. But another piece of Audubon's wingspan in the region is just this network that we have that exists within the region. And that centers on over close to 100 years of conservation advocacy and land ownership in the region. But it also includes those grassroots members, over 70,000 of which include you that are listening on this webinar, and you guys are represented through 30 different chapters across the region. And then the last, but definitely not least, is this fact that we own 33,000 acres within the region that we are actively managing. And what that goes to show is this region, we have an invested interest in it. It is our home range just as much as it is the home range of the birds that use this. And so to kind of demonstrate, next slide, we wanted to give a little bit of an overview of some of the projects that are already happening within the region. And the examples that I'm going to show are by no means all inclusive. They're just a collection of some of the ongoing activities that we're already doing within the lower Mississippi River region. And they run the gamut from on the ground field monitoring and field work all the way to policy and to clean energy advocacy. So starting in Missouri, we've partnered with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for over a decade now to monitor bottomland forest aviation populations through a method of surveys called point counts. And those point count surveys have been conducted on over 49,000 acres of floodplain forest islands and adjacent areas. That data that we've collected through those surveys is helping the U.S., it's helping to inform the Corps of Engineers forest management within this region. Next slide. If we move on downstream to Arkansas, another example of some of the work that we have going on in this region is our NATIVE program. The NATIVE program, what that stands for is Native Agriculture to Invigorate Ecosystems. And what this is we provide, or our staff provides technical and financial assistance to historically underserved agricultural producers. Those producers are then growing native seed, and this is local ecotype seed that then can be used for local prairie and other habitat restoration within Arkansas and within those ecoregions. As of right now, there are 12 different agricultural producers who are growing upwards of 86 acres of native grass for seed production, as well as 16 acres of pollinator-friendly forbs. Next slide. So looking at an example in Mississippi where we've partnered science with our policy and advocacy work, we were able to take this, to use our scientific data to show and to demonstrate the importance of the Yazoo backwater area to over 450 species of birds and to wildlife. And one example of that is the pectoral sandpiper that's pictured here on this graphic. So through the data, we know that over 30% of the global population of pectoral sandpipers utilize the Yazoo backwater area during peak fall migration. So by combining this data that we have, as well as our advocacy and policy, we were able to work towards the rejection of the Yazoo Pumps drainage project in 2021. And then traveling further down to Louisiana, we have an example of our green energy advocacy. So in Louisiana, we are working to advance clean energy access and climate-friendly policies at all levels of the government. We've worked with the city of New Orleans, and they are becoming one of the first cities in the Gulf South to commit to 100% net zero carbon emissions by the year 2040. We've also participated in the governor's climate initiatives task force and helped create the state's first ever plan to reduce its contributions to global carbon emissions. I'm going to turn it over to Jill, and she's going to speak more about some of the opportunities as well as the threats that are present here in the region, and then go over our mapping program.
Great, Stephanie, thank you. And hello, everyone. I much appreciate you joining us. I'm Jill Mastro-Totero, Audubon Delta's Mississippi Policy Director based in Jackson, Mississippi. And I'm going to provide a little more context about the many challenges and opportunities facing birds and communities in the lower Mississippi River region. And let's start with birds and habitats. As one of the nation's most important arteries for navigation and commerce, as Stephanie summarized so well, the lower Mississippi River region has been extensively modified to support human infrastructure and economic growth. Unsurprisingly, we've seen these impacts to the landscape result in many problems, including poor water quality, invasive species, and altered hydrology. The situation is even more dire since the lower Mississippi River alluvial valley has lost over 80% of its bottomland forested wetlands over the last century, while other habitats from the Gulf Coast and up through the flyway have been severely fragmented. These landscape level impacts have significantly undermined the network of high quality stopover habitats migratory birds need, and put the health and survival of many birds in the region in peril, like the Prothonotary warbler shown here. Similarly, strategic water management activities are needed between the Gulf Coast and interior wetlands up through the flyway in order to address alarming population declines in many shorebird species. Simultaneously, climate-driven weather is putting birds and people at greater risk. Recently, Audubon declared a bird emergency as North America has lost 3 billion birds since 1970, and 2/3 of North American birds are at risk of extinction from climate change. These many threats signal urgent action is needed to restore and reconnect the landscape and improve land and water management practices. Next slide, please. This culturally diverse region extends from the birthplace of jazz and northward to the breadbasket of America, spanning sprawling cities and rural agricultural towns. While the mighty Mississippi remains a powerful economic engine and a vital resource for people and wildlife, its spring floods have also brought great hardship, and the complex system of structures built to control the river have largely failed. Today, these seasonal flooding and water resource impairments are further complicated by climate-driven disasters. Tropical weather events and hurricanes pose serious threats to coastal and inland communities, and we only need to look back on the 2021 hurricane season to understand that it doesn't take a Cat 5 Hurricane Katrina, like we see here in the Gulf, to cause widespread and lasting devastation. More intense and frequent rain events, including changes in snow and rainfall patterns in the upper basin, are worsening flooding for many communities. Across coastal Louisiana and Mississippi, more than $9 billion in property value is at risk of increased flooding with 6 feet of sea level rise. It's also well documented that these disasters disproportionately affect low-income communities, communities of color, and indigenous communities, all of which points to a critical need to prioritize just, equitable, and inclusive community resilience work. Next slide. Given the complexity of these many challenges, it makes perfect sense that our Lower Mississippi River Blueprint focuses on advancing nature-based solutions and partnering with communities to identify ways to enhance their resilience to climate change and other threats. As many of you know, nature-based solutions or natural infrastructure is engineering with nature, protecting, restoring, and mimicking natural landscapes, such as wetlands, river floodplains, and barrier islands, to protect communities from storm surges, flooding, and other climate-driven risks, while providing important habitat for birds and other wildlife. We know the region's diverse ecosystems also deliver many additional co-benefits, including improved air and water quality, nature-based recreation, and good paying restoration jobs. One example of Audubon's ongoing natural infrastructure work is through our partnership with the Lower Ninth Ward Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development in New Orleans to restore what was once an old growth cypress swamp located in a predominantly Black neighborhood that endured a disproportionate amount of impacts from Hurricane Katrina. Our blueprint targets conservation and restoration in the region's hundreds of thousands of acres of publicly managed conservation areas, while acknowledging that significant opportunities exist in working with private landowners who hold a majority of property in this region. Partnerships with these public and private landowners are key to strategically restore and protect habitats that can reduce climate-driven risks to communities while supporting birds as climate change shifts their suitable range and habitats. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to switch gears for a moment and do a quick overview of how we've identified nearly 50 million acres across the region as the most important places for birds and people. And Joanna Grand, who led this important work for our team, is standing by to answer all of your questions, because I am not a GIS expert and I do not play one on TV. But let's start with our mapping overview. A key tool in the development of this blueprint was in designing a model to help us prioritize this regional landscape for conservation actions through the lens of Audubon's strategic priorities. The results of this effort are available for you to explore in a web app that can be accessed at the URL shown at the top of the slide or just dropped into the chat. This app explains the general approach we used and also links to a document with a detailed description of the methods and all of the inputs. Plus, you can find these specifics in the blueprint's appendix. Next slide. So a core input to our model was the 16 priority bird species Stephanie introduced you to that we identified to represent the region's diverse array of habitats, which you can see here in the table, each of those 16 species reflected in the number of habitats that we identified for the Lower Mississippi region. We used Audubon survival by degrees climate models to map the current and the predicted future, the 2050s, distributions for each of these 16 priority species. We also included known priority areas in the region, such as important bird areas and protected areas, distributions of particularly important habitats like bottomland hardwood forests, co-benefits to people, such as locations of socially vulnerable communities, and current and future landscape conditions, including human modifications of the landscape, such as development, and predicted future threats, such as continued urbanization or anticipated sea level rise. Next slide. So we further define the model's parameters by defining our boundaries of the study area using HUC 6 watersheds. And we included some watersheds outside of the Mississippi River watershed boundaries due to the locations of Audubon properties, such as our Pascagoula River Nature Center on the eastern coast of Mississippi. All of the modeling was conducted at a resolution of 1 square kilometer, and we stratified the analysis by inland in the blue and coastal in the orange on this map, given the major differences between the two landscapes, such as differences in species, habitats, or threats. And then we used NOAA's marsh migration extent to delineate the boundary that you see between the two colors. In terms of the model inputs, we weighted all birds equally. We are Audubon after all, but we weighted the birds twice as high as non-avian inputs as well. Next slide, please. So after running the model twice, once for the present day landscape and then once for the future 2050s, selecting the top 30% of each time period and combining those results, what we identified is nearly 50 million acres of high priority habitat across the Lower Mississippi region landscape to focus Audubon's conservation strategy and actions. In terms of those areas that had a high conservation value in the future, but not in the present, shown on purple in this map, just over 12 million acres are identified to restore. For those areas that had a high conservation value in the present, but not the future, those areas in the orange, just over 12 million acres are identified to adapt. And finally, for those areas that had a high value in both the present and the future, those areas in the green, 24.5 million acres are identified to maintain. So this map shows there are tremendous opportunities to do innovative conservation work that brings lasting benefits to birds and people across this region. And Brent is now going to share our strategy to achieve these goals.
All right, thank you, Jill. and I'm going to take us into the Conservation Impact Plan. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining us from New Orleans. My colleagues who came on the presentation here before me have set the stage for the Conservation Impact Plan. We've talked about the importance of the Mississippi River, the work that Audubon already does within the Mississippi River region as defined. And we've walked a little bit through the spatial analysis, the mapping work that we did to identify areas where engaging in programs, implementation activities, or policies can help us do the most good. So given the stage that we've set with the mapping activity, with Audubon's wingspan within the region, how can we achieve measurable and meaningful progress within the lower Mississippi River region? The answer is the Conservation Impact Plan. Just as the mapping exercise identified the geography in which we can operate to have a great impact, the Conservation Impact Plan identifies the strategies and actions that we can take to get the biggest bang for our buck and really accomplish some meaningful objectives and make progress toward those objectives in our region. Next slide, please. Strategy 1 is scientific analysis and program implementation. This is staying true to Audubon's vision of actionable conservation through best available science. This is a two-pronged approach. Not only are we going to continue the scientific analysis, research, and on-the-ground work that we're doing throughout the region, but there's program implementation. This is putting projects on the ground. This is collaborating with coalitions to achieve the implementation of restoration projects or adaptation projects. It's working with regional partners and funders to implement programs and projects that enhance and restore priority habitat with an eye to climate resilience, cutting edge science, and community engagement. This is the intent of Audubon, to continue the work that we're doing and expand it and prioritize it for greater impact, to grow our work through partnerships. Some of the examples of this were already given earlier in the presentation, but when I think about how we tie our scientific analysis to on-the-ground implementation, Audubon partnered with the Coastal Restoration and Protection Authority here in South Louisiana to do an analysis of bald eagle habitat along the Louisiana coast. This bald eagle index is going to incorporate and inform the next coastal master plan for the state of Louisiana. On to policy advancement. Next slide, please. Policy advancement is us continuing Audubon engagement with our policymakers and officials at the local, state, and federal level that promote a healthy and resilient environment for priority bird species and human communities. So you get the question a lot when you work in the policy arena. So what is it you do? What is policy, and what are you changing when you work in the policy arena? Policy for us is identifying an Audubon fingerprint on the results of decision makers and elected officials. This could range a wide gamut. It could be an ordinance for native plants in a community. It could be testimony on Capitol Hill for the Water Resources Development Act. It could be a city council resolution adopted by the city of New Orleans, or it could be the recently adopted Climate Initiative Task Force plan in the state of Louisiana. This is us informing things that happen on the ground with Audubon priorities and our vision for the future. Our policy advancement is based in strong partnerships and a shared vision for the future. Resilient and prosperous habitat complementing the local engaged communities. This is a point that has shown up already a couple of times in our presentation, but while we view the work that we do at Audubon through the lens of bird habitat, the human communities in our neighborhoods are the essential element. The solutions that we identify and move forward to implement must be rooted in the people that live here. The Audubon slogan you see in a lot of our materials is where birds thrive, people prosper. And we think that that sort of concept has informed the Lower Mississippi River Conservation Blueprint and the work that we're planning to do. We also see our policy advancement as being possible through some of the work that we're already doing. And Stephanie walked you through the different centers and wildlife refuges that we have in this footprint and some of the work that we're already doing on the ground. In moving our policy forward, we can always use these Audubon centers and the programs we have there to set the stage for greater objectives, engagement, and conservation successes. And finally, next slide, please. Strategy 3, community engagement and empowerment. And this is a touchback to the point I made in the last slide, that our Audubon priorities and the implementation strategies that we pursue must remain rooted in the communities that we serve. This is us working within the existing network of chapter members, people who subscribe to our newsletters, people like you who tune into a webinar, and build this network of chapters, partners, and other communities to inform Audubon work and to support it with our resources. And this last bullet, very important to the work that we do, to respectfully and thoughtfully uplift the voices of underrepresented, historically disadvantaged, and climate-threatened communities. Tying one more time back to birds thrive, people prosper. Our communities, the groups that are already working within our communities, and the people who have set the stage for greater conservation work in the past should tell us what our priorities should be, can be, and how to grow our programming. There can be a tendency from groups that are excited about doing work in a particular area to say, oh, I've got a great idea, so I'm going to partner with your group, and here's what we can accomplish. Our goal is to not tell anyone what their priorities should be, but work with the groups that already exist and help us prioritize the work that we're doing, side by side with the local community, so we can have a greater impact for birds and for people. This also includes doing extensive work with our campus chapters, engaging our folks at the college level who are interested in conservation work and helping them engage in policy in the region. And once again, just engaging and uplifting the voices that are out there. So while this isn't an exhaustive list of all the actions that we can undertake, more can be found within the strategies of the Conservation Impact Plan in the document itself of the blueprint. And as mentioned before, a lot of us are happy to talk a little bit more with anyone on this call about the partnerships we'd like to form, the ways we think we can go about geographically and policy-wise achieving our goals. I believe we're headed into the Q&A session right now with Rachel driving the bus.
Yes, thank you, everyone. So we already have a ton of great questions in the chat on both Zoom and Facebook. I'll put in another request. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we will address them. While you are typing, let's see what questions we have already. First, Elizabeth on Zoom asked, and Joanna, you might have started to answer this in the chat, but she says, I'm curious about the areas that were mapped as important for bird habitat now, but not in the future. Why is that?
Yeah, so I did start to answer that question. In some cases, for example, with the cerulean warbler, climate change is predicted to shift the species distribution outside of the range of our study area. But it could also be, we included predicted urban growth and sea level rise as future threats. So they could also be eliminating or degrading habitat. So that would again lead to lower conservation value in the future.
Thank you. And there's another related question, Joanna, that I think you typed, but not everybody could see. But Peter on Zoom asks to provide examples of what we mean when we say adapt, restore, and maintain certain habitats in the mapping exercise.
Right, so adapt would be so we classified an area as suitable for adaptation if it is high value in the present, but predicted to be low value in the future. So an example of an adaptation strategy could be some type of natural infrastructure project that is designed to mitigate the impacts of sea level rise. Areas designated for restoration are those that are low value in the present and high in the future. So that would mean that in the present, the area is probably degraded or the climate is not suitable. So in terms of degradation, reforestation would be an example of a restoration project to address that. And then areas that are high value in both the present and the future, those are classified as areas to maintain. And an obvious example of that would be to establish some kind of protected area.
Thank you, Joanna. That's really helpful. And while we're on this topic, Paul on Zoom asks, what is the time frame for these projects? That's a tricky one because we don't have individual projects identified in the conservation blueprint itself. Does anyone want to take that?
I would just offer that, some of the projects that we've talked about are ongoing initiatives. So some of the work we've done with local governments on renewable energy, for example, is an ongoing thing that kind of ebbs and flows with the legislative session or with the meetings of the Public Service Commission. Some of the work that we do with states and local government is going to be something that's aligned with their schedules. So an example for that would be the Climate Task Force in Louisiana. They had a year to put together a plan. So we engage with them throughout the process of the different stakeholder meetings or the different opportunities for input. I would say the sooner that we can get more coalitions built, get more projects on the ground, get more programs going, super.
I guess I'll also jump in and say that, so as far as time frame goes, this is our blueprint for moving forward. And some of these projects may be 5 years out, 10 years out. We looked, to 2050 as far as for our models and looking at those key areas of either habitat restoration or maintenance or adaptation. And so with any type of blueprint like this, you've got these short-term goals and projects, but you also have to be we'll be looking out further, especially with these adapt projects, the things that the areas that fall within this adapt idea. And then also recognize that this is just like any good conservation kind of plan and blueprint. There will be reiterations and where we come through and reevaluate and see what we have done, what we need to kind of shift directions on. And so I would hope that this is kind of both a short-term 5-10 years, but then also feeds into more of our long-term large conservation goals.
We have a couple of questions about soil erosion in the region. Thomas on Facebook asks, what role does soil erosion and excessive fertilizers have to play in affecting our birds' overall health? We have a related question from Marshall, wondering if someone can take both of these. He says, soil is so unstable along the Mississippi, at least in Louisiana. I would think stability of soil is a big concern for habitat loss. Is soil stability on banks of rivers a part of this conservation blueprint?
Yeah, I'll take that one. No, we did not include soil stability. That is probably something that we could include in the future. We did include, we put a lot of emphasis on agricultural land. So that, may account for some of what you're talking about, but yeah, soil stability along the river banks is not something that we considered. That's something we can definitely talk about adding.
And Joanna gave a good, mapping and sort of technical analysis answer to that. And I would say that as far as soil stability along the riverbanks and along the coastlines, I think that, any of the actions that we've done to benefit habitat, be that management up at the Riverland Center of Water, or be that engagement with the Coastal Master Plan in Louisiana, we've definitely done a lot of work on ways to bolster, adapt, or to restore that habitat, all the way from advocating for funds for Deepwater Horizon oil spill to go to restoration projects, to on the ground implementation of projects that provide for a more stable coastline and riverbank.
Thanks. Here's a tough one from Allegra. How do you ensure that government policy initiatives survive across subsequent administrations? That's the question.
Welcome to the question I ask myself almost every day. It's tricky, and to have, not even administrations at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, I keep talking about it, we've been engaged in this climate task force work in Louisiana, and it's built a durable community of people who are engaged on climate issues all the way across industry to conservation groups to government officials. And that's kind of my answer is you have to build a very wide base of people who are engaged in, supportive of, and understand the reasons for these kind of initiatives. That way, with the change of administration, you still have this wellspring of support that crosses political lines, that crosses different communities. And that is tricky, is an easy way to say it. It's a very difficult thing to do. But I would point out to a couple of things that we've engaged in. One is some of the energy policy work that we've engaged in Arkansas has made it through several different public service commissions and a couple of sessions of the Arkansas legislature. And that's because not only were we able to communicate to the stakeholders and elected officials that solar power is good for communities and for birds because of climate change reasons, but also it's a great economic engine for Arkansas as far as the jobs surrounding clean energy implementation. And if you can build that sort of coalition of people who are bought into it and understand its importance from a different spectrum of reasons, it becomes more durable because you'll have people, no matter who the administration is, who'll step up and talk about how important certain actions are or certain policies.
And if I could tap into some of the great comments that Brent has made, because of course policy is close to my heart. Having been with Audubon now for 4.5 years thereabouts and worked for other national environmental organizations over my career, what has excited me most about Audubon is the true bipartisan commitment that we make when we advance our mission, whether it's in the halls of Congress or testifying in front of committees that are taking up key issues that connect to birds and our work across the country. Or it's, as Brent was saying, down on the ground in our state capitals, working to educate and engage decision makers from all political walks of life to understand that these are often legacy opportunities for these policymakers to think about what they can leave behind and leave their mark on when they, have an important decision to make in front of them. And so I think what we really try to do at Audubon is lift up the important voices of so many of you that have joined us on this call, because you are the folks that are out birding, that are out, working in your community, taking your kids to the local park, understanding the importance of birds and nature. And as staff, we help to make sure your voice is lifted up in the fray, whether it's at the state level or in Congress. And so it's such an important dynamic and partnership that we have with all of you out there, and we're grateful for that. And that's, to me, the kind of what moves Audubon so well in our mission and in making so much conservation wins.
Thanks, Jill. There's a couple more related questions here. Peter asks, what role do Indigenous communities play in your planning and execution efforts of the blueprint? And Charlotte also asks, relatedly, how do you propose to help low-income communities specifically?
I'll tackle some of the low-income communities question, at least. Partnering with organizations that advocate for common objectives has been a very successful way for us to do this. If one of the wins that we talked about earlier in the presentation was a clean energy standard for the city of New Orleans, we were able to join a coalition called Energy Future New Orleans, and these are partners in conservation who you may not have seen coming. And it was Audubon working with the Alliance for Affordable Energy, or the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, or the Greater New Orleans Interfaith Climate Coalition. This is a host of people who we're really focused on affordable energy prices, because in New Orleans, we have a pretty big problem with energy poverty, where our energy bills are a large chunk of our annual income, generally across the board. So we partnered up with folks who were able to speak for, because they were in more low income communities, and they were able also to advocate for their friends and neighbors for the objective of lower prices of energy. And some of the way to get there are administrative barriers in the way the energy is regulated in this part of the world. Some of that was also looking at more sustainable sources, which is where we came in for advocating for clean energy, a more upgraded grid, and more options for how we source our power. So it's partnering with, it's providing a platform for, and it's also knowing when to get out of the way and let people speak for their own selves.
And I'll just add, in terms of, working with Indigenous communities, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity across the region to really build those alliances. In Mississippi, we have engaged with some of the Choctaw Nation through our Pearl River work, and helping to bring them in to understand the importance of the river and some of the threats to that important resource, and how their voices and advocacy and their actions can really help be brought to bear. And capacity building is another tremendous opportunity that organizations like Audubon really can bring as a partnership, a collaborative opportunity, especially with low income and Indigenous and more marginalized communities. And one piece of the work that we've done in the Mississippi Delta more recently is partner with community-based organizations in that part of the state to help be educated and be informed about federal programs that can help alleviate flood risk to many of these parts of the Delta, being the poorest in the nation. Often it's homeowners that do not have the resources to get themselves out of harm's way, and so helping to provide a conduit for information and also capacity building, so that community leaders and community organizations can help serve their constituents and members better. And it's been a great program that we're really looking forward to growing in the years to come, because we know that climate-driven disasters are continuing to take their toll, and we know that these communities bear the brunt, in most cases, the worst of the impacts. And so how can we help empower them and be at the table for getting the resources that they need, I think is often the biggest challenge that they have. And so it's a great part of our work that I know we'll be growing into through.
Thank you both. How about a bird question? Elizabeth asks, out of the 16 target bird species that we have picked out, what species are likely to benefit the most from our efforts? And what species are in the worst trouble?
So our hope with so we go back to, we chose those 16 priority bird species based on a lot of different factors. Some of them were chosen because they are some that are maybe the most susceptible to some of the impacts that we see happening along and throughout this region. And then some of them we chose because they are really good umbrella type species for the habitat that they fall in. So, some of the most vulnerable and the ones that are probably, at least within our region, will suffer the highest losses through the next 50 years. Really, we use the example of the cerulean warbler, which is a beautiful little warbler, wood warbler that we almost didn't include in the model, for the very reason that our climate model and predictions show that if things continue as they are with temperature rises and habitat changes, that species, its breeding range will move outside of even the lower Mississippi River region. And to be sure, its kind of stronghold of its breeding habitat is definitely in the Appalachian area and kind of in more of the eastern states, but we do have those populations in kind of the central and the northern portion of the Mississippi River. And so that species shows a lot of potential, or that it could fare some of the worst out of some of the species. And then, as far as which species plan to or could benefit the most, it really depends on each. It will depend on the ground actions and the policies and the outcomes of this blueprint as we move forward. But our hope is that by choosing the species that we did, we'll have a net benefit on not just those 16 priority species, but on all the species that fall within their kind of species assemblages and habitat areas. And so I don't know that we can point to one certain species and say, we really think that, this species is going to increase by X amount. It will depend on the different projects and how these, how our partnerships with other conservation entities and different actions happen. But our intent is that we'll have a greater lift for most species across the board because we've chosen species that kind of act as a broad umbrella for a lot of different communities.
Thanks, Stephanie. We have a few questions from Alex that are all good process questions that I think we'll want to address. One, is there a development document anywhere that outlines what data sources are feeding into the blueprint? 2, are species data coming from state occurrence data? 3, 4-part question, are there joint venture data captured in this tool? And also, have y'all been involved in any state wildlife action plan developments? I imagine some state wildlife agencies would be interested in incorporating these priority areas as they look to update their conservation opportunity areas. So I think the answer to the first 3 questions might be an easy yes, and I can drop a link to the PDF itself where you can find our appendix and data sources, Alex. But does anybody want to address his questions or her questions?
Well, Rachel, I don't know if I caught all the questions, but in terms of the state wildlife action plans, we understand that this year is going to be the update for many of those plans across our region. And so we think the timing is just spot on for the rollout of our blueprint. And we're really looking forward to working with our state conservation and wildlife leaders to hopefully share and inform with them the priorities and opportunities that we think can help move the needle for birds and other wildlife in our states.
And I'll just add, there was a question, I think, about the joint venture data. We did include a prioritization that was done by the LMJV in our web app as an overlay for comparison. It was not included in our model, but it is in the app there for people to explore as well.
Yeah, and I'll add in, so a lot of the data that goes into the model, as Rachel said, you find kind of the inputs for the model and that mapping, the priority mapping analysis in the document. And then there's a link to an appendix that kind of really deep dives into how it was done. But species occurrences and the data that feeds in to using those 16 species that we chose is definitely included in the model. And then our intent is that this conservation blueprint adds to the narrative of conservation entities across this region. And so with the joint ventures, I mean, we we are working with them, and it's not to replace anything, but this is our blueprint is just another added layer. And the hope is that we can then combine all of the different entities and the work that's being done and kind of really hone in on where the most important and the broadest reach will be, and make some really important on the ground conservation wins, both from a community point of view and then from a bird point of view. But we are working with those conservation partners, whether it's state level or regional level throughout the blueprint area.
And I see Tara just chimed in the chat from the Audubon Center at Riverlands and said that Audubon's important bird areas are included in Missouri's State Wildlife Action Plan. So we're being considered in this region and have participated in bird focused planning in that state in Missouri. So many good questions and offers to connect. Looks like we might have time for maybe one or two more. Sumya asks, do you work with any international organizations in countries along the birds' migratory path, birds who use this region and maybe use other countries as well throughout their life cycle?
So I think the short answer to that is yes. We are not, especially a part of the National Audubon, are partnering with different, we recognize that you can do everything to help preserve and to protect habitats and species within the kind of artificial political boundaries of the United States or state by state. But if we're not working across their full life cycle, including both their wintering and their breeding territory, then you're missing a really key component. And so we are working with organizations and entities around the world, and especially with Central and South America. We have some dedicated staff that kind of act as conduits for that. But then on a more kind of minute species level example, we have been involved within the region with some work that partnered with looking at prothonotary warbler migration and their movements. And so some of our staff have been closely involved with international researchers to answer kind of those questions as to where are these birds going and what habitats are they using. And so that's kind of the long answer to your question, that yes, we recognize that's extremely important. And yes, we are working on that. And we would love to do more.
Yes, and I see Kara just dropped a link in the chat to the Audubon Americas webpage, which explains Audubon's reach throughout the hemisphere. Audubon doesn't just exist in the US, we are in Central and South America as well. And Eric from Audubon Delta also mentioned, yeah, the Prothonotary Warbler Working Group coordinates with partners in the US, plus Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia. Okay, we unfortunately have too many questions to address within the hour. So if we didn't get to your question, we will try to follow up with you directly, especially for those of you who have asked for us to follow up with you. Kara, I will hand it over to you to take us home.
All right, thanks, Rachel. And thank you to all the participants for such a lively Q&A session. And if we did not get to your question, please feel free to email me and I'll get it to the appropriate project team member to get you an answer. And I also provided the link right here, audubon.org/lower miss. And you can find our blueprint document there. You can find the story map. You can find the interactive map and a blog that we wrote about the blueprint. So please visit that URL for any of those documents. And just as a reminder, this is being recorded and we will send out the recording to all attendees. It will also be posted on our website and on our Facebook page. So once again, we appreciate your support and commitment to birds. We couldn't do this work that we'd love to do without your support. Have a great afternoon and thanks again. Bye-bye.